Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you in the name of Medical Care Service for Refugees Bochum, a social medical human rights organization and psychosocial treatment center for survivors of torture and war. My name is Bianca Schmolze, and I'm responsible for the human rights advocacy projects in our organization, focusing on refugees' rights and the rights of survivors of crimes against humanity to truth, justice, and integral reparation. With our work on Justice Heals, we promote the international fight against impunity and lobby for the rights of refugees guaranteed in the UN Convention relating on the status of refugees. I'm very happy that we found two excellent cooperation partners in Medico International and the Institute for the International Law of Peace and Armed Conflict to realize this digital series of lecture on the occasion of the 17th anniversary of the Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees. I would also like to thank the Foundation for Environment and Development North Rhine-Westphalia and Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for funding this project. Let me introduce you to my colleague Robin Pass, the manager of the Institute.
Yeah, Bianca, thank you very much. And of course, also a very warm welcome from my side to this first of 8 lectures that we have planned over the course of this winter term. I think while you were waiting, you saw the overview of the lectures in total. So of course, we hope that you've already bookmarked the other events and that you're eager to join us for them as well. Because over the course of these events, we try to dive into the complexity and multi-layered nature of the human challenge of flight and migration and shed some light on some of the central aspects of the global refugee regime. Within this lecture series, a critical perspective is of importance to us, which is, of course, always the case or should be inherent to science anyhow. But in the case of refugee research, I think this has a very special character. Because after all, and I'm not sure if everyone is aware of this fact, but 80% of the world's refugees are located in the global south, and yet 80% of the research published on refugee issues comes from scholars of institutions in the global north. And we intend to therefore pay special attention to what some label somewhat a decolonization debate and counter this imbalance by including voices from the global south and female researchers from there. And while putting this series together, we have been in close contact with the LERRN network, LERRN being short for the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network, that has kindly supported our endeavor. LERRN has set itself the task of incorporating the voices of local partners from the South into the research agendas and debates of the North and to strengthening participatory approaches. And I will continue, or I will go on and post the link to LERRN in the chat so that every one of you can have a look and find out more about their course, because it's definitely worthwhile. Bianca, you are muted, a classic.
Thank you. Today we are going to shed light on the history of international refugee protection and how the UNHCR was built and the Refugees Convention elaborated and ratified in 1951, 70 years ago. We will go far back into history to learn how international refugee protection developed over the last centuries and how past conflicts and wars influenced refugee policies and led to an institutionalization to guarantee refugees' rights and obligations of states to host and protect refugees. We are delighted to have two distinguished experts on our panel today with whom we can discuss these issues. Phil Orcutt is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Wollongong in Australia and the co-director of the Center for Critical Human Rights Research, as well as a senior research fellow at the Asia Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect and a senior research associate with the Refugee Law Initiative of the University of London. His research and teaching interests focus on international efforts to provide legal and institutional protections to internally displaced persons, refugees, and war-affected civilians. Phil Orcutt published a lot of books about refugee policies and the rights of refugees. We are going to give you a link to his profile where you can find his bibliography that we recommend to read. And we have to be very thankful that Phil Orcutt is here with us today, as in Australia, it is now in the middle of the night.
Absolutely, Phil. Special praise for that. And of course, then we have our second panelist, Rez Ghadi. Rez is an international lawyer and human rights activist. She was born in a refugee camp in Pakistan as her family escaped Saddam Hussein's genocidal campaign against the Kurds. Eventually resettled to New Zealand as part of a UNHCR resettlement program, Rez went on to become New Zealand's first Kurdish female lawyer. She graduated as a Fulbright scholar with a Master's of Law from Harvard Law School, becoming also the first Kurd in history to graduate from Harvard Law. Rez is the co-founder of the Center for Asia-Pacific Refugee Studies and an adjunct research fellow at the University of Auckland. She is also the co-managing director for Refugees Seeking Equal Access at the Table, or in short, RESEAT or RSEAT actually, a global initiative seeking to solidify commitments from states to enshrine refugee participation in the global refugee regime. Her previous roles include working as a legal officer for the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, as a commercial litigator at New Zealand's preeminent law firm, as a lecturer on international law and human rights, and most recently in Iraq as a Harvard Human Rights Fellow, building cases for the prosecution of ISIS regarding their targeted genocidal campaign against the Yazidis, including mass executions, kidnapping, torture, sexual violence, and other human rights abuses. Rez has a wealth of experience advocating for the rights of refugees at global fora. She is the founder of Empower, a youth and refugee-led organization addressing the underrepresentation of refugees in higher education, and she contributed to the Global Summit of Refugees in 2018, which led to the establishment of the Global Refugee-led Network. In 2020, last but not least, she helped establish the Refugee Steering Group for the UNHCR annual tripartite consultation on resettlement. Bianca, you said it, two very distinguished speakers, and we are super happy to have you. But before we open the floor to you, just let me give some very, very brief technical explanations, because obviously after our presentations, we are very much looking forward to your questions and the discussion. And for that, once you look at your black screen and below our faces, you have two buttons. One is chat and the other is Q&A, or F and R in German. The chat is for more general conversation and comments, but we would kindly ask you to post all the questions and comments that you have into the F and A button. Then we can sort them and we can address them in due time. And as this can also be somewhat interactive, we would actually like to encourage you to also ask these questions in person. So you don't necessarily have to type them, but we can also unmute you so that you have the option to ask them in person and get into contact with our distinguished panelists. Now, with that being said, and without further ado, I would actually hand over to Phil Orcutt, who is about to kick us off with his introduction. Phil, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much, both for that introduction and for the invitation to present today. I'll just get my screen share going. Okay, and okay, that should now be visible. Yes, perfect. And obviously I have been asked to start this 8-panel set of presentations off, and I wanted to do it by discussing a little bit about what happened before the Refugee Convention and some of the debates and history that actually led up to it. And I'll start by going to look obviously at today's picture, the number of forced migrants globally. And this chart shows the numbers as they've increased from 1970 through to 2020. And you're probably all aware of the growth of forced migrants that we've seen, particularly since 2011 with the Arab Spring. And we've seen, of course, growth in the number of internally displaced persons, who now number approximately 48 million globally, as well as the growth in the number of refugees under UNHCR's mandate, which are approximately 20 million, and under UNRWA's mandate, the UN Relief Works Agency referring to Palestinian refugees, which are slightly under 6 million. Now, it's important to look at the history of how we understand refugee protection to understand almost why these different categories exist. So let me take us back, going all the way back, in fact, to the 17th century and the Huguenots. The Huguenots, or French Protestants, were the first group recognized as refugees who are actually referred to by that term. And their story begins in 1685 when Louis XIV of France revoked the Edict of Nantes, ending religious toleration in France. He attempted but failed to stop some 200,000 Huguenots from fleeing the country. This was seen to violate the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, and particularly the Peace of Westphalia's right of jus emergandi, or the idea that if your religion differed from that of your prince, that you could leave the territory with your property. Now, other states were obviously opposed to this violation, and they were quite critical of Louis's actions, but they didn't want to go to war for it. And instead, what we saw was the development of a new practice. These states, led by Brandenburg, other German states, then the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, instead accepted in the Huguenots and provided them with legal protections. So this is the first group where we see not only the term refugees used, but also the idea that they need to be protected in law by other states. Now, interestingly enough, this pattern doesn't actually continue after this event. We can identify a number of other religious refugee flows over the next century. Frequently, these flows were accepted in, usually by individual states, but they were not offered similar legal protections. Thus, the Waldensians fled from Piedmont to Switzerland, the Palestinians from Palestine to England, the Salzburgs from Austria to Prussia, Jews from Austria who were eventually allowed to return, and the Acadians who were forced to leave Nova Scotia within the British Empire. In each case, though, these groups were accepted in, but they didn't receive similar protections to what had been offered to the Huguenots. Now, this pattern begins to change significantly with the French Revolution. For the first time, we see political refugees be accorded the same protections as religious refugees. And interestingly enough, here we see the development of more entrenched legal protections at the domestic level for them as well. This begins in the United Kingdom with the passage of a series of Alien Acts, which gradually define a right of asylum for refugees. In France, this begins during the Revolutionary period and then gets entrenched in 1832. The US takes a slightly different approach, deciding to actually not introduce any immigration restrictions at the federal level, and this pattern continues until 1875. As Thomas Jefferson had argued in 1792 to the then US President George Washington, we should not wish then to give up to the executioner, the patriot who fails and flees to us. Political asylum during this period becomes understood as a responsibility of liberal governments. But this is a fairly thin responsibility, marked by some legislation in two countries, but not by legislation in the United States. And of course, it's a fairly small number of countries that are offering these protections. This begins to change through the mechanism of extradition law. Interestingly enough, up until the mid-19th century, each of these states had very few extradition treaties. In fact, Britain, for example, only had two other extradition treaties with France and with the United States. And as British Foreign Secretary and later Prime Minister Lord Palmerston argued in 1851, if there is one rule which more than another has been observed in modern times by all independent states, both great and small, of the civilized world, it is the rule not to deliver up refugees unless the state is bound to do so by the positive obligation of a treaty. And Her Majesty's government believes that such treaty engagements are few, if indeed any such exist. Now, this begins changing in the latter half of the 19th century after Belgium introduces the innovation of simply saying in its domestic law that it would not return any political refugees through an extradition treaty. Following that period, England adopts similar legislation, and they rapidly expand the number of extradition treaties they sign, as you can see in the chart here. But most notably, as they increase the number of extradition treaties that they sign with other states, these states too adopt similar understandings and then transmit it across the European state system through their own extradition laws. So by the end of the 19th century, we see this as a widespread pattern, and a pattern that continues today. Interestingly enough, This is a pattern of protections for refugees which isn't governed by international law. There's no international organization, there's no convention that marks this. And so frequently this period gets referred to as being a laissez-faire period, simply because these states only engaged in some practices and they weren't bound by international law to do so. And yet these laissez-faire policies were remarkably successful at protecting political refugees. As Bernard Porter has argued, between 1823 and 1906, no refugee who came to Britain was ever denied entry or expelled. Now, these policies were helped by the fact that we saw relatively few acknowledged refugees. The numbers tended to be in the thousands or at most tens of thousands per year, in part because open migration continued through much of the century. So large-scale religious refugee movements, such as Jews fleeing from Russia, generally weren't accommodated within the system. Instead, they were able to openly migrate into different countries. And it's only in the late 19th century, driven by rising anti-Semitism and fears over the specter of anarchism, that immigration policies begin to tighten. We begin seeing collapses of these standards, introductions of new laws in the United States and then the United Kingdom that close off some of these responsibilities. But it was truly the First World War that broke the system, because the war itself, as well as its aftermath, generated huge numbers of refugees. The Russian Revolution alone, for example, produced over 1 million. And it was up to the new League of Nations to respond to these crises. In 1921, they responded by creating the High Commissioner for Russian Refugees, and they appoint a Norwegian diplomat and former polar explorer, Fridtjof Nansen, to the role. This is the first formal international organization to protect refugees. And Nansen creates a truly unique innovation. He argues that these refugees need to be protected in international law because they weren't able to move from country to country. And he does this through what gets called a legal arrangement system, which provides first Russian refugees and then other groups with protections under international law, as well as a distinct legal identity. This begins with the Russian refugees and then gets extended to Armenian refugees in 1993 and Assyrian, Assyro-Chaldean, and Turkish refugees in 1928. The arrangement system marks the first time that we see clear international legal protections for refugees, but the system was limited in a number of ways. First, it was very politically problematic in two senses. With the Russian arrangement, some 52 states signed on to it, but by the 1928 arrangement, only 13 states signed on. And because of the way the arrangement system functioned, if you didn't receive an arrangement, you were not recognized as refugees. So for example, a number of conflicts during this period, such as after the fascist takeover of Italy or the Spanish Civil War, did not see refugee status extended to those groups. And unfortunately, while Nansen was a larger-than-life figure within the League, after his death in 1930, their efforts began to fall away. They replaced the League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees with its much smaller International Nansen office. And they proceeded to create a number of successor organizations during this period, including a standalone agency for Jewish refugees from Germany in 1933. This was partially because of the politics of the League at the time. They wanted and hoped that Germany would rejoin the League after its departure. And so they didn't want to bring the question of Jewish refugees into the main body of the League. There were some efforts to improve legal protections during this period, including through the introduction of the 1933 Refugee Convention, but these remain very limited. The 1933 Convention, for example, still only extended rights to the groups that had already been recognized by the League. And these also weren't signed by many states. Only 17 states signed it, and only 8 ratified it before the Second World War. And obviously, in the lead up to the war, it was recognized that in particular, the League needed to take actions to assist Jewish refugees. Unfortunately, the 1938 Convention concerning the status of refugees coming from Germany was signed by only 7 states and did not enter force before the war. Now, by the late 1930s, there were also other actions occurring outside of the League, and particularly after the Austrian onslaughts, US President Franklin Roosevelt became much more determined to take some form of international action. Unfortunately, he was limited domestically by his own restrictionist Congress, and so he sought to internationalize the refugee issue by having the US host a conference in Evian, France. The Evian conference, unfortunately, basically fails. One of the things the US rapidly discovers is that other states were similarly unwilling to accept in refugees. And in fact, some states attended the conference as refugee-producing states wanting to pass their their own populations off to other states. The result of the Avian Conference is only the creation of a weak new international organization called the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, which was created to primarily negotiate with Nazi Germany to allow refugees to leave the country. Unfortunately, its efforts are very much stymied in the late 1930s period, leading up to the start of the war. And unfortunately, these legacies of failure are dramatic. As Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the future president of Israel, argued in 1938, the world seemed to be divided into two parts: those places where the Jews could not live and those where they could not enter. And the legacies of this period is that simply the Jewish population, many could not leave Germany during this period. Between 160,000 and 180,000 German Jews, out of a population of 522,000 in 1933, were unable to leave Germany before the outbreak of the war and went on to die in the Holocaust. With the start of the war, Jews and other population groups were unable to flee from Nazi-occupied territories. But the failure here also lay with other states, states that were unwilling to accept in these refugees, states that blocked their entries, as this newspaper article from 1938 noted. The legacies of failure meant that following the Second World War, there was a dramatic change in how we sought to approach refugee issues. And perhaps strangely enough, given the failure of the Evian Conference, the US and Roosevelt's successor, President Harry Truman, were actually very active in this role in creating the post-war architecture of how we respond to refugees. Truman understood the need for clear international refugee protection for both humanitarian reasons and for European stability. He was shocked by reports about how concentration camp victims were still being treated, unable to return to their own homes, and effectively being housed still in the concentration camps where they've been kept, only protected by US soldiers rather than guarded by Nazis. He also related in a television interview in the early 1960s about how he was shocked by this because of his own family connection to refugee movements when they were affected by the war between the states, as he refers to it, the American Civil War in Kansas. Unfortunately, he is initially blocked once again by Congress, which still refused to accept in more refugees. But Truman deals with this by doing two big innovations. The first one, at the domestic level, is to successfully reframe the refugee issue away from the World War II politics to be within a Cold War security lens. As Senator Alexander Wiley argued in favor of legislation, if we revise this law speedily and equitably, it will be a real inspiration for all free people. It will be an ideological weapon in our ideological war against the forces of darkness, the forces of communist tyranny. And he also played a really critical role in the development of the norm of non-refoulement, the idea that refugees cannot be returned to their own states. This is in part because he engaged in massive returns. Following the end of the war, some 2 million Soviet POWs were forcibly returned after Yalta, Soviet prisoner of war. But Truman and his cabinet gradually became convinced that forced returns were morally wrong, with arguments within their own government leading to the shift in position. Instead, the US shifted to supporting a clear conception of non-refoulement, even at the expense of losing Soviet support for the new International Refugee Organization created under UN auspices at the end of the Second World War. This would go on to become a cornerstone of international law in the 1951 Refugee Convention. Perhaps most notably, though, Truman continued to support this idea of non-refoulement during the Korean War. It was a key point that blocked negotiations and the end of the conflict, even at the cost of prolonging it by over a year, with the US suffering nearly half of its casualties during that period. Thus, as we sit at the eve of the negotiations around the Refugee Convention and the creation of UNHCR, we can look back at this history and argue that three clear international norms existed that states generally understood. First, refugees were seen as a group that were distinct from other migrants. Secondly, it was understood that they needed protection in law, first at the domestic, and then at the bilateral, and finally at the international levels. And third, that they also needed protection from a formal international organization. Oddly enough, though, as we look at the history leading into the convention, it was still not clear who refugees actually were. Because prior to the 1951 convention, no clear refugee definition existed. The League of Nations had generally taken a group-based approach under the arrangement system, as we've seen. They had focused exclusively on a lack of protection rather than having cross borders. So if you were Russian under the Russian arrangement, you gained refugee status, irrespective of whether you had left Russia and irrespective of why you might have left Russia, even if you were outside the country. The 1938 Convention concerning the status of refugees coming from Germany continued this pattern, stating that refugees lacked the protection of the German government. As Sir John Hope Simpson, one of the key refugee experts in this period, writing in 1938, argued, this is a very difficult definition in response to this 1938 convention. So far as I can see, the convention covers the people in the concentration camps inside Germany. They do not enjoy, in fact, the protection of the German government. And this pattern continues after the Second World War. The wartime United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, had dealt with refugees and displaced persons, including German Jews rescued from concentration camps equally. And the UN's International Refugee Organization had both refugees and displaced persons outside of their own country within its mandate. Further, we were also seeing the growth and creation of new flows of refugees during this period. By 1949, the IRO still had a hard core caseload of some 200,000 refugees who could not be resettled. They remained from the Second World War. But there were also newer flows of refugees globally, flows that were outside of Europe. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 displaced over 700,000 Palestinians and led to the UN creating a separate agency, the UN Relief Works Agency, UNRWA, for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. Similarly, the Korean War between 1950 and 1953 created 7 million refugees and led to the creation of the UN Korean Reconstruction Agency. And of course, there was the Cold War factors within Europe as well, with some 15,000 refugees entering West Germany a month by the end of 1950. So as the convention negotiations began, there were questions around who should be included within. The question became even more complicated when Greece sought to include their own internal refugees within the convention, not for reasons of legal protection, but rather to receive assistance. As they noted, the problem of legal protection did not arise in their case, for they were in their own country, but their material distress was causing great anxiety to the Greek government. Their position gained support from a range of other governments, including from France and Australia, with Britain proposing a global refugee definition that would include both de jure and de facto stateless persons. Oh, sorry, I didn't quite edit these slides correctly. In addition, the Brazilian representative noted a similar situation that applied to India and Pakistan. As he argued at the convention negotiations in 1949, would those who voted for the draft resolution under consideration later be able to deny those millions of human beings the same kind of assistance they decided to render to the European refugees in the care of the IRO? The United Nations, however, could not discriminate among refugees. Oddly enough, for the country that had supported a lot of these initial innovations in the immediate post-war period, the United States deliberately blocked this effort to include internal refugees. As Eleanor Roosevelt, serving as the US delegate to negotiations, argued, these internal refugee situations were separate problems of different character, in which no question of protection of the persons concerned was involved. Why did this occur? Well, even though the United States supported a strong refugee convention, they did not want UNHCR to have an assistance mandate. They wanted it to be a small organization, much smaller than the IRO it was replacing, one that would primarily focus on legal protection only. And thus, within their own internal debates, they noted that internal refugees, such as those in Germany, Greece, India, Pakistan, and in China, the US government felt, did not need international protection, but would nevertheless raise serious problems of material assistance if they were included, and hence would require a significant expansion of UNHCR into assistance operations, as well as the need to provide legal protections. Now, they were able to block this through clever maneuvering, through gaining France's support, And eventually it was their understanding that underpinned the development of the Refugee Convention definition of refugee status. But let me end briefly by noting the failure to include IDPs within the Refugee Convention. This internal refugee debate, obviously, of course, now we call them internally displaced persons, but this internal refugee debate meant that it would be decades until they were recognized as a true international problem. Beginning in the 1970s, UNHCR did provide some assistance to IDPs, but only when requested to do so by the UN Secretary General or by the UN General Assembly. And this was not provided as part of their mandate. A clear factual description of internally displaced persons instead would have to wait for almost 50 years, when the non-binding 1998 Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement described them as persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. While this definition has been brought into regional hard law, including through the African Union's 2009 Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in Africa, otherwise known as the Kampala Convention, there remains no international convention for IDPs. I'll end my presentation there, but I hope you've enjoyed this brief summary of this history.
Phil, thank you very much for this tour de force and this wonderful overview. I think, international norms and these frameworks gradually emerged, and it makes total sense to understand them within the context of their respective times. So thanks for this. And I would now hand over to Rez, whom we've asked to, in a way, formulate a bit of a critique of this history and of the modern protection system. As some of its negative impacts are still part of the realities of refugees today, obviously. So Rez, I would ask you to continue, and then afterwards we open the floors. And I don't know if you could see it, Phil, but there's a round of digital applause for you for this first presentation. So kudos to that.
Thanks very much, Robin. So I guess to start, I'd just like to note the three phases of the modern international refugee regime. So the first phase being of collective recognition of refugees, which went up to the Second World War. The second phase of transition, which occurs during and shortly after the Second World War. And then the third phase of individual recognition and other forms of protection, which begins with the establishment of the UNHCR and entry into force of the 1951 Convention, which continues to the present. So now that Phil has really set out a comprehensive, I think, background to the development, I will go into some of the critiques, as Robin mentioned, and offer some perspectives as a practitioner rather than as an academic like Phil. So on 28th of July 1951, when the convention was originally adopted, it was to deal with the aftermath of the World War II in Europe, even as the Cold War was setting in. The inspiration for this convention was a strong global commitment to ensuring that the displacement and trauma caused by the persecution and destruction of the war would not be repeated again in history. But during the following decades, it globalized, and the 1967 protocol expanded the scope of the convention as the problem of displacement spread across the globe. In these origins lies the convention's humanitarian character, which ensures that its fundamental concepts remain intrinsically sound. It has, though, it must be recognized that in 70 years since the convention, the world has been undergoing significant transformations which pose serious challenges to the capacity of states to respond to contemporary displacement solutions. The reoccurring cycles of violence and systematic human rights violations in many parts of the world are generating more and more intractable displacement situations. And also importantly, the changing nature of armed conflict and the patterns of displacement and serious apprehensions about uncontrolled migration in this era of globalization are increasingly part of this new environment in which refugee protection has to be realized. In addition to those factors, new threats of displacements have arisen that were not considered at the adoption of the convention, such as those posed by climate change and environmental challenges. Forced displacement is a growing global concern, but its impacts are particularly felt in the global south. The problem is exacerbated within an international legal environment that lacks both adequate and responsive rules and strategies to address its root causes. International law, often looked upon to provide solutions to global challenges, has serious limitations when it comes to the issue of forced displacement. Displacement is nothing new. Human populations have been forcibly displaced throughout history. However, it was only in the 1920s that multilateral effort was forged to regulate the problem. The evolution of the multilateral initiatives culminated in the creation of the UNHCR, as well as the adoption of the Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol. These remain the prominent legal and constitutional frameworks dealing with displaced people. Since the creation of UNHCR and the adoption of the 1967 Protocol, the evolution of institutional and binding legal frameworks governing forced displacement has slowed down, if not to say it's halted completely at the global level. Notable exceptions in this regard are the adoption of treaties by regional mechanisms, such as the African Union on refugees and internally displaced persons, and the promotion of the rights of internally displaced persons since the 1990s, as Phil mentioned, the guiding principles on internal displacement. And also the adoption of the recent Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration, all of which are in the domain of soft laws. Nonetheless, the existing system remains inadequate as the refugee framework continues to be challenged by mass displacement of both reoccurring nature, such as conflicts and disasters that have been ongoing throughout history, but also relatively recent phenomena, as I mentioned, climate change. Refugee law is an example of an international system of laws that's evolved in consideration of Eurocentric cultures and continues to advantage and favor the West while disadvantaging subaltern nations. This non-inclusiveness, if I may, within the international law of global South voices and their interests contributes to this, the development of inequalities. The League of Nations era sentiment that human displacement was a temporary crisis requiring temporary measures remained with a focus on displacement occurring in Europe. However, we know that numbers of forced displacement are increasing every year. Also, statistics indicate that most displacement cases currently originate and culminate in the global South. The high number of displaced persons and the disproportionate impact of forced displacement on the global South countries enables a dominant narrative to emerge that tends to blame the global South for being somewhat dysfunctional and erases the historical context. But the reality is much more, sorry, I've had a power cut. So I think my internet's still connected, but you can't see me. It might just come back in a moment. The joys of living in the Middle East. There we go. We're back. So I was saying, the reality is much more complex and structurally imposed. So despite the reality of the disproportionate impact of forced displacement on global South countries and their people, the overwhelming mainstream media and attention is away from the movement of displaced persons that occurs within the global South and away from the critical analysis of the causes that lead to these movements in the first instance. Much of it, mainstream attention is devoted to this tiny fraction of movements that lead from the South to the North. Those that make it to the borders of Western countries receive the majority of media coverage, most often unfavorable and unfavorable depictions of those refugees as invaders, and tend to describe them as flooding Europe or the West. As a practical consequence of this, refugee and policies pertaining to asylum of Western countries continue to be driven by placing the focus on movements to the North. There are gaps in international law that affect the governance of forced displacement as a global challenge. And in light of that, this forced displacement remains profoundly to lack addressing the root causes. The Syrian refugee crisis, as well as the recent caravan originating in Central America, are some examples of this. The rules that exist within the international law framework seek only to address certain aspects of forced displacement. The Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol remain the sole normative frameworks governing the protection and assistance of forcibly displaced people globally. These normative frameworks have severely limited applications. As Guy Goodwin Gill noted, the 1951 convention does not deal with the question of admission, and neither does it oblige a state of refuge to accord asylum as such or provide for the sharing of responsibilities. The convention does not address the question of causes or flight or make provisions for prevention. Its scope does not include internally displaced persons, and it is not concerned with the better management of international migration. Alongside these existing gaps in international law and the measure of resistance from states that contribute to the global displacement crisis, the Global South experiences additional layers of disadvantage due to its relationship to international law. And this can be seen in two angles. So firstly, international law rules that developed in the early and mid 20th century to regulate and respond to forced displacement were focused on displacement as it existed only in Europe. So Global South displacement is therefore largely invisible under existing rules. Secondly, Global South struggles to thrive in an international legal framework that is skewed in favor of the interests of Western states. It promotes the prosperity of the West while leaving the Global South facing an upward struggle. And it's important to note that during the period of development of international legal and institutional frameworks for the response of forced displacement in the early and mid 20th century, much of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East were under colonial rule. The struggle for independence was gradually intensifying, and following decolonization, these newly independent states ratified frameworks of response, yet these frameworks had been shaped without their input, and they were largely already outdated at that time. The forced displacement outside of Europe were invisible to the League of Nations and its predominantly European member states, and subsequently to the UN. The Global South and displacement crisis that was occurring there was disregarded by these multilateral engagements, even though colonial Europe was directly responsible in many ways. Indeed, the frameworks that were initially developed to liberally manage forced displacements as it existed in Europe, but later morphed to strictly regulate forced displacement as it interacted with Europe from the outside. An ongoing bias against Global South displacement is powerfully demonstrated by the self-serving shifts in the policy stance of the Global North states. And the academic Chimney noted, in the post-1945 period, and the policy of Northern states has moved from the neglect of refugees in the Global South to their use as pawns in Cold War politics to now their containment. And so in acceding to European norms and institutions after independence, the Global South embraced solutions that had been fine-tuned to a European context. The Global South's displacement during their struggles for independence and after independence, and to some extent even today, resemble those of the interwar period displacements. The existing legal framework is simply not fit for purpose. As a result, the Global South continues to host the highest number of displaced persons within a weak framework of responsibility sharing under the international law. And another important point to note is that there is a growing focus by major state actors to pursue unilateral protectionist approaches focused on protecting their own borders, which then again exacerbates this problem. The traditional understanding of durable solutions within the refugee framework tends to focus on three main areas: voluntary repatriation, local integration, or third country resettlements. These solutions are wholly concerned with the protection and assistance of people who are already displaced. Preventative approaches that aim to remove or minimize the root causes of forced displacement have not been integrated into the law. A preventative and comprehensive engagement before displacement occurs is therefore lacking. And without the adoption and implementation of a new approach, global South displacement is likely to just continue. We know that forced displacement does not occur in a vacuum. Rather, people are forced to flee due to a constant dynamic of root and proximate causes that affect their lives and safety. And so this failure to seriously consider and devise mechanisms to address root causes has contributed to this rising number of displaced people since the 1920s. The solution, I believe, to forced displacement, as argued by many scholars, cannot be attained merely through a selective legal reform. The inadequacy and unresponsiveness of international refugee law plays its part in aggravating the crisis, and the solution therefore requires much more than targeted reforms to the regime governing forced displacement. So any legal reform needs to be very comprehensive in its identification and dismantling of these unequal structures that have played such a major role and continue to play such a major role in creating circumstances that compel people to flee in the first place. This, in turn, then requires an unprecedented measure of willingness to cooperate strategically to address the root causes of forced displacement. A lasting solution in that regard then should aim for reformed international law that is comprehensive and preventative, rather than just narrowly tailored to advance politically expedient positions or to promote border protection or unilateral gatekeeping. A robust engagement with the progress of the Global Compact on Refugees and Migration and the Sustainable Development Goals would provide an opportunity to appropriately address forced displacement, because each of them recognize that engagement and cooperation are essential. A common feature of all of these three initiatives is that the preventative aspects they embrace and the comprehensive approach that they also embrace in their areas of focus. In particular, the Global Compact on Refugees was born out of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which endorsed the need for a comprehensive refugee response framework, CRRF for short. This framework is a multi-stakeholder approach involving local, national, and international actors that aims to protect and assist refugees and support the host states and communities by promoting international cooperation and responsibility sharing. The New York Declaration envisaged that this framework would be a model approach to be developed and implemented with respect to each situation involving large movement of refugees. And it pays particular attention to responsibilities regarding reception, admission, support for immediate and ongoing needs, support for host countries and communities, and the pursuit of durable solutions. And finally, another fundamental aspect which cannot be overlooked with respect to achieving durable solutions is the participation of refugees themselves. While many of the Refugee Convention's drafters were themselves refugees and drew directly on their personal experiences of displacement, today we see a considerable lack of refugee engagement on issues that impact us. From decision-making outcomes to research that has the potential to influence law and policy related to the predicament faced by refugees, it's imperative that refugees play a key role. As refugees, the circumstances that we are born into are shaped by powers beyond our reach, yet we are the ones that live the consequences of persecution and displacement and the laws that purportedly are used to provide pathways to protection. As a refugee, going through the legal processes of refugee status determination, identification, credibility assessments, and asylum proceedings can be very disempowering and frustrating. We are subject to laws and systems that were not created for us or by us. While it is referred to as refugee protection, in today's refugee regime, in many ways, it can epitomize a system that is often designed to protect against us, to keep us out. And while theoretically speaking, seeking asylum is recognized internationally as a right, in practice, many asylum seekers are treated as criminals. The political discourse on refugees has shifted from seeing us as at risk to seeing us now as a risk. And paradoxically, a system designed to protect some of the most vulnerable people in the world can make us feel even more vulnerable and helpless, further exacerbating the pain of fleeing from our homes. We find ourselves tasked with navigating the complexities of legal systems, often in languages that are foreign to us, to reach some semblance of protection afforded under the Refugee Convention as recognized refugees. Yet disappointingly, to be able to successfully navigate these systems does not really result in guarantees all the time. Access to education, employment, and living a somewhat dignified life in the host country remain everyday uncertainties, as does the prospect of being resettled in a third country. And while there are many scholars like me who also happen to have lived experiences of displacement, refugee voices are still largely unheard in refugee research and scholarship. Refugee situations have increased in scope, in scale, and complexity, and this necessitates new and innovative methods for protection and for assistance and for solutions. While the status quo may continue to work for some issues, the large-scale refugee movements and protracted refugee situations persist around the world, which indicate to us that things must change. And so finding the best responses and solutions for the complex issues facing the millions of displaced people across the globe requires strong evidence-based research and a commitment to translating findings into impact. Importantly, it requires input from those with lived experiences of displacement for the development of policies that are closer to the reality on the ground. Participation begets solutions, and refugee participation is not only an ethical imperative, it can contribute to changes in policy, the development of law, and durable solutions that are innovative, sustainable, and more impactful. The importance of reflecting the perspective of those with lived experiences of displacement has been highlighted in many fora over the last few years. However, there are still a number of obstacles that hinder the participation of refugees. So we need to develop more effective measures for redressing the imbalance in legal scholarship and legal research to include refugee voices. And I know that we can do better. There are many avenues for better incorporating refugee perspectives into academic research in a more genuine and systematic way. But refugees are not homogenous, and neither are voices. We belong to many different national, social, religious, and ethnic groups. And inevitably, we have varying opinions and beliefs. So there could never be, one refugee voice that can represent a comprehensive refugee voice. As such, scholarship should endeavour to seek input from scholars representing diverse views and include different nationalities, ethnicities, and other backgrounds. We need to create scholarship identified by people currently displaced to address current and future challenges associated with forced displacement. And to achieve these goals, this requires a prioritization and orientation towards capacity building and co-designing to ensure that we can provide a platform for scholars with displacement experiences. And another aspect is that leading and emerging scholars can facilitate research and training and scholarship opportunities which result in specific deliverables and ensure genuine and effective participation and involvement of refugees in academic work which has the potential to impact and respond to the challenges and opportunities relating to refugees. With unprecedented numbers of displaced people globally, it is now more important than ever to work together to come up with practical, effective responses to displacement through multidimensional, multidisciplinary, and intersectional approaches. The call for nothing about us without us is not merely a call to engage with refugees in consultations and research, then to write about us. It is a call to make space for us to use our skills, our perspectives, and our experiences to contribute directly. After all, we refugees are the experts of our lives and the issues affecting us, and we should be treated as such. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dearest, for finding these clear words and also the appeal to change, to really change this international discourse on refugees' rights and protection. So we already have some questions and remarks from the public. And first of all, before we continue, just the information, we are recording this webinar. So for those who want to participate now in the discussion, I will not read your names, or we will not read your names. When you decide to appear personally, you of course can do, but for those who are just writing your questions, we will not give your names. Okay, so I will start with the first one. The first one disappeared. Will, there was a first?
No, the first one is actually a comment that I have responded to. So
okay.
If
Sorry,
you want, you can read it out.
So then we start with this one here. Hi, I'm a human rights consultant based in Germany and very much interested in refugee issues. Question to the kind panelists: are Palestinians considered refugees falling under the 1951 convention? If so, why can't the UNHCR provide them protection? Why do they need a separate organization, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, short UNRWA? That is basically and merely keeping them alive, but not helping them get out of their perpetual refugee predicament. Thank you all. So who would like to comment on this first? So would you like to start perhaps?
Yes, I can come in a little bit on the history here. Primarily why they aren't is because they predate the convention. So as I mentioned in my presentation, you basically have immediately after the Second World War, institutional architecture created within the UN based around the International Refugee Organization, which is almost exclusively focused on European refugees. And they just don't get included. And so what happens is instead, the UN responds by creating the separate organization. And as I mentioned, this is basically how the UN responds to these crises during this period. So they do the same thing with respect to Korea. The difference there is, of course, in the Korean case, that resettlement happens. Most of those refugees from North Korea do get rehoused within the South, and then that organization is able to shut down. Since the Palestinians haven't received any form of durable solution, UNRWA continues to manage their issues.
Rest, do you want to add something about that?
I think important to note that the international refugee regime is failing as a system because we are getting more and more displaced people every single year. And so I note this question about keeping them out of their perpetual refugee predicament. I think it's important to note the percentages of people that are resettled as a percentage globally. So currently we're looking at 1% of refugees being resettled globally with, and so taking that into account, I think the question is really important and identifying the failure of the system as a whole. So whether protected under UNRWA or under UNHCR, there simply are not enough solutions to address the number of displaced people currently around the globe, and that there are not enough durable solutions currently identified for all the number of refugees that we're dealing with: displaced people, refugees, stateless, Palestinian refugees protected under UNRWA. So I think the system as a whole is failing, and that's an important consideration to take into account.
Bianca, the comment that you thought was lost is actually shifted in the Q&A section, but I will read it to you anyhow, and maybe you have some thoughts on that. So one of our participants said that there should be a rule that when foreign nations invade a country for whatever reasons, they must also become responsible for facilitating people who are forced to be displaced and become refugees on foreign land to enter into those countries, and their dignity be respected and not be treated as us and them and exposed to dehumanization. We witnessed when foreign nations bombed Iraq, Syria, and Libya, producing mass displacement and forced immigration towards Europe, and unable to live in their home countries and could not enter other countries without being dehumanized, sorry. I mean, ideally, that should be the case, absolutely. Phil, Rez, do you want to say anything about this comment or share any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, it's a critical question. So there's very little accountability mechanism within the 1951 Refugee Convention. There is no prohibition against displacing your own population within it or displacing other populations. So it doesn't function like other human rights conventions. The Convention Against Torture, signatories shouldn't commit torture. That's one of the core elements within it. And the 1951 Refugee Convention is completely silent on that issue. And so what we have to do is look for other forms of accountability mechanisms. There are some that exist, particularly in international criminal law, forcible transfers and forced deportations, dealing with people being forced outside of states' borders and displaced within a state's borders are one mechanism of responding to that. Specifically, when it comes to foreign interventions, that's obviously, it is a critical question. The US used to have a practice where you tend to see them resettle large numbers of people from countries where they had been involved in conflicts. So for example, the Vietnamese refugee movements in the 1970s, now my tiredness is kicking in. And that pattern continues through the 1990s, and then it really breaks down in the last 20 years. And so sort of the Afghan movements that we've seen in the last few months is one of the first times that the US has really sort of returned to that idea. And obviously there, they were primarily prioritizing people that actually worked for their forces, rather than looking at the people who required asylum more generally. So that's been a very limited response. And to be blunt, yeah, that otherwise there isn't any requirement, there isn't any obligation on the part of states. There are arguments, you can see them within the notion of the responsibility to protect doctrine, which requires the international community to become involved in cases of mass atrocities where war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing occur. Obviously, all states have a responsibility under that to prevent that occurring to their own populations. The international community has a responsibility to assist states in preventing that from happening. And in cases where states are manifestly failing, the UN Security Council can also play a role there. That's how the intervention in Libya occurred. But there is no requirement as part of that process to engage with refugees, engage with IDPs, even to engage in reconstruction. There was an idea of a responsibility to rebuild when it was first proposed, but that completely got dropped in the 2005 negotiations that led to its creation. And so basically what we see here is, yeah, there isn't a responsibility that actually exists that requires states to take this kind of action. They sometimes do, but they aren't required to do so.
I think there's some more questions, Bianca, right?
Yeah, so I put them together because it's now more, again, about the history of the Geneva Convention and about the UNHCR. So which historic developments led to the extension of the GRC's 1967 protocol and the extension of its mandate, of the mandate of the UNHCR? Is there a relation to decolonization wars and subsequent forced displacement? And what about UNHCR's role in forced return programs throughout the 90s? So who's going Yeah, please.
I can start on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, so and I'm sure, I know I'm not talking completely about the convention. I know other people will be talking about the convention in the next few presentations. But basically, the 1951 convention was incredibly limited. So in the refugee definition, there was both what was called the dateline clause and the geographic clause. So to be a refugee under the 1951 convention, you need to have been displaced as a result of events prior to the 1st of January 1951. And states could decide whether they applied it to Europe or Europe and elsewhere. Obviously, those kinds of restrictions made sense in a limited way when it was negotiated. It was basically designed to prevent states taking on a longer term obligation, but it rapidly fell apart. Obviously, having a dateline clause that you have to have been displaced as a result of before 1st January 1951 makes no sense as you move into late 1950s. And UNHCR started doing some very clever legal gymnastics around that. Paul Weiss, the key legal advisor, made an argument that basically they could accept in refugees fleeing from communist states in Eastern Europe because those states had become communist prior to 1951. And so that allowed them to use it. But by the 1960s, that mechanism was basically unworkable. And similarly, the language around Europe meant that this wasn't applicable to, as you mentioned, the question, decolonization. Obviously, it's not applicable to Africa, where we see growing refugee flows in the 1960s. It's not applicable to Asia, where we similarly see growing refugee flows. And so that's what the 1967 protocol did, is literally remove those two elements from the definition to make it, for the first time, really a global convention, and to also remove that dateline clause.
I think Phil covered it mostly. So I think the only thing I can really add to this is the effect of the protocol means the Refugee Convention now applies universally amongst those states which have adopted the protocol, the only exceptions being in Turkey, which has expressly maintained the geographical restriction, Madagascar, which has maintained the geographical restriction and hasn't adopted the protocol, and St. Kitts and Nevis, which has not adopted the protocol as well. So those are important to note about the geographical restrictions in those countries.
We have another question, Rez, and it's particularly for you. It reads, first of all, my most sincere thanks to the speakers for their analysis of the history and development of international refugee law. I would like to pose the following question. The Refugee Convention and its additional protocol are quite ancient documents in terms of legal history, and Rez, referring to Guy Goodwin Gill, has pointed to the many shortcomings and the narrow scope of protection under the convention. In the meantime, the way refugee law, or let's say the norms of refugee protection, are developed has changed to more hybrid mechanisms of soft lawmaking. Take, for instance, the New York Declaration or the two global compacts. Do you think these new modes of international lawmaking have any merit, or are they just a cover-up for the lack of consensus on reforming refugee law?
I think that's a very, very good question, and I have mixed thoughts. So on the one hand, I talk about the refugee system being a failing system and needing reform, but at the same time, I have concern, as many other academics, scholars, practitioners do in this field, that if we have any reform, we'll end up with less protection rather than more, because of the nature of the world that we're living in today, and that would actually be quite a negative move in terms of eradicating protections and rights for refugees and displaced people rather than ending up with more protections. And so that is one risk that we must note. And so in lieu of that, there are many states, many academics, many civil society activists and lawyers who do not want to push for reform precisely for that reason. In lieu of such reform, these initiatives and like the declaration and the compacts are a move towards trying to get some of those protections in, but of course these are soft law, and so the ability to enforce them is really limited. But I think what's important to note here is that these states agreed to these global compacts. And so they've specifically agreed on language that they're willing to accept and to some extent enforce. And we know this because during the negotiations, and I took part in the negotiations for the Global Compact for refugees, where we advocated for in particular, more refugee participation, more protections for youth and children, more protection for disabled and more vulnerable displaced people, such as those with LGBTQI backgrounds. And so a lot of that wording did not make it into the compacts. And so on the one hand, they are soft laws, they're not the same level as a treaty or convention, but on the other hand, the willingness of the states to negotiate and to debate what they're willing to accept and not accept must therefore, at least indicate some willingness on their part to adhere to them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so concerned about the wording. And we can say, for example, there was specific wording about LGBTQI that unfortunately did not make it into the global compacts because of particular states not agreeing to that wording and those protections. But on the positive side, wording in particular paragraph 34, which talks about meaningful refugee participation being included. And so I'm somewhat hopeful that through that process, states have agreed because they're willing to protect those needs rather than just doing it for the sake of it.
Thank you. The question is still how to hold governments accountable when they really do not fulfill even the deals they made with the Global Compact. So this, I think, is still a problem of our future we need to find solutions for. Phil, do you want to add something to that?
Yes, I might, just particularly on the soft law angle. And yeah, the compacts from the IDP side, the compacts completely neglect IDPs. They rarely get mentioned. And I've had it confirmed it's because the US forgot to mention them. Which is part of the problem of these types of processes. Certainly, those do provide a potential angle, and I agree completely with Rez that we've got huge issues. If we opened up the Refugee Convention for renegotiation, it would be a significantly more limited instrument than we have now. And the similar issue exists around IDPs. Walter Carleton, who played a key role as basically drafting the guiding principles before he became the Representative Secretary General for the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, noted that while there was interest in an IDP convention, there was actually concern around it, not least because the guiding principles as they exist restate existing rights for IDPs as established in existing international human rights law, humanitarian law, and analogous refugee law. And there were actually concerns, including from Walter, that if they actually negotiate an IDP convention, that might actually give some states an opportunity to effectively alter the rights of existing human rights conventions through the negotiation. And so that is one of the issues that we're facing, that we know that we need to extend protections, that we know the Refugee Convention is very limited, and yet to do so might actually leave us in a worse place than we are. And so soft law is a stopgap for that, but then it loses enforceability and it loses basically the same level of adherence that we see from the Refugee Convention.
There is an advice from one of our guests who's saying, please visit the International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. There's also a link. And the person says this international center has conducted research comparing international legacies of trauma in the diaspora, with those staying or returning to what they name their homelands. So just for you, an idea for perhaps to look at it. And then we have another question. So thank you very much for your insightful presentations. During both presentations, one could indeed note that those who are most affected by refugee law were not included in the drafting process. Do you believe that it is realistic to expect that refugees will be included in discussions now? We have seen, for example, that some groups of people have found their way into affecting the shape of international law, the International Labour Organization being one such example. Any ideas on what could be done for refugees to have a similar standing? Is it, from your viewpoint, political unwillingness or lack of social support that has prevented this reform from happening so far?
Yeah, if I may, I'll start with this question. It's a very important point that is one that I'm actively working on with a lot of fellow refugee advocates. And it both baffles me and intrigues me, the state of representation in the refugee global forums. If you think about a conference focusing on women's issues, say, for example, UN Women, and women were not present, or there were 70 women in the room, what would the reaction be internationally? What would the media headlines be? If you had a conference focusing on the rights of Indigenous people, of people with disabilities, and you did not have people from those people, persons of concern at those events and conferences, what would the reaction be? Yet when it comes to the international refugee regime, when we have these high-level events in Geneva and in New York, refugees are evidently absent. And we had the Global Refugee Forum in 2019, where 70 refugee leaders out of 3,000 participants were there, and everyone was celebrating that there were 70 refugee leaders. If the same were to occur for a UN Women conference, that would not be an achievement. That would actually be a huge disgrace. And so the international refugee regime in this regard is far behind other forums and events at the international level in bringing the voices of the people that are most impacted. And this is precisely the work that I'm working on as the co-managing director of Refugees Seeking Equal Access at the Table, or for short, our seat. Since 2016, a prominent theme of UN agreements on refugees has been a commitment to enhancing the role of refugees in the making and implementation of policies that affect refugees. And as I mentioned before, through strong advocacy and negotiation from refugee advocates, refugee-led organizations, community leaders, our NGO supporters and allies, we were able to get paragraph 34 into the Global Compact on Refugees, which states responses are most effective when they actively and meaningfully engage those that they are intended to protect and assist. So this builds on the work that we've been doing, that responses are more effective and more legitimate if refugees are involved in the decision, in the design of refugee responses. And so, while we're still very far behind, we've come a long way in terms of refugee participation over the years. I remember one of the very few first conferences I attended in Geneva, where refugees were invited to come share their journey, share their personal stories, really tug at the emotional, emotions of the audience, and then kindly move aside while the experts talked about the policies and decisions for us, on behalf of us. But we're seeing a difference now where people are recognizing in the global community the value of refugee participation, in particular in the events that I've taken part in particular, establishing the refugee steering group for the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement at the UNHCR and the Global Refugee Forum, and now working directly with governments to institutionalize refugee participation and build a mechanism to include refugees as part of their government delegations as has been the practice by Canada since 2019. So, despite these achievements, there's still a long way to go. And hopefully we can urge more states and UNHCR and NGOs to really support active participation within their own structures so that we can achieve more meaningful engagement of refugees in these decisions that impact us.
Thank you, Rez. I hope with our series of lecture, we can do a little contribution to that. Phil, do you want to also say something about that?
I just add that I think this is a really critical issue. Representation has always been lacking. And I think the comment was made, even back to the Refugee Convention negotiations, where some of the people in the room had been refugees, and then that idea gets lost. Like the first High Commissioner of Refugees at UNHCR is a refugee. Gotthard, had fled from the Netherlands during the Second World War. And then that sort of knowledge gets lost within the organization, but it also gets lost more generally. And I think it's really critical, and the efforts of organizations like RC are critical for bringing that voice back in.
Thank you very much. So we will, during the next sessions of our series, we are going to discuss these details, these aspects more in detail. So I invite all participants to follow our series. There will be always the perspectives of the global North and the global South. And I hope that this will also be a sign of solidarity and that we all should come together and fight together for refugees' rights. So there are no more questions coming in. So I think we come to an end.
Bianca, maybe before we do that, I would actually have one, I think, final question, and then Phil can get some well-deserved shut-eye. But I think as this session was titled about the history of refugee protection, I would actually ask the both of them a very, in a way, open question, and that is, what are some of the most important lessons that we can actually learn from the history of refugee law? What were things that were good in the past and that we should focus on in the future, and what were things that we couldn't get rid of, if you allow for this, in a way, very brief and open question to conclude our session?
Okay, I might start. I guess probably one of the most important innovations, as I mentioned in my presentation, was the development of the norm of non-refoulement within the convention. And I think it is definitely under challenge right now, that we see states through extraterritorial policies designed basically to get around their obligations. And we increasingly see states also being unwilling to even consider it at their borders. So obviously I'm based in Australia, where we've got our offshore processing centers for boat people, where they're not even allowed into Australia. And even once they're deemed to be official refugees, they will not be resettled to Australia under current domestic legislation. And so many of them have been sitting in two offshore processing centers in Papua New Guinea and Nauru. The Papua New Guinea one is basically shut down. The Nauru one is still there. But we see similar policies being adopted by a lot of other states. We see similar interest obviously in Europe around these. We see the pushbacks happening with Haitians in the US right now. And these are all critical issues. And unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic. I'm really hoping that we can see a concerted effort to push to make sure that non-refoulement remains an important and core norm of the refugee regime. But I don't know if we're going to be able to win that fight. So sorry for being probably more pessimistic than you were looking for, but.
And from my end, I think, and Phil also noted, and I've discussed the contributions of refugees and persons with lived experience to the development of the early international refugee law and policy were significant. And while refugees as a category or a group had no formal decision-making power at the time, their contributions, really were fundamental to our understanding of the way in which international law and policy pertaining to refugees has been developed and negotiated to date. And so that's an important lesson that we can use moving forward, that This provides a practical example of how refugees can be meaningfully engaged in the creation of laws and policies that affect them. So moving forward, we should really build on that historic engagement of refugees in the creation of these laws.
You're absolutely
Those are wonderful
right.
Closing remarks, I think, right?
Perfect. Yeah, so thank you very much, Phil and Rez. Phil, I wish you a wonderful good night. And I would like to remind all participants that in 2 weeks, on the 11th of November, there will be session 2, and then we discuss very in detail the Geneva Convention and also its protocol from 67 and the legal implementation by governments. So thank you very much for this evening. Robin, you also want to say some last words?
I'm good. Thanks for all
Okay.
the participants. Thanks for the questions, for the lively debate, and see you in 2 weeks. And obviously, Phil, thanks for staying up late. Rez, thanks for your passionate words and these inputs. Have a wonderful rest of the day and a wonderful night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.